It's been just over 6 months since Russia invaded Ukraine. And in that time, thousands of lives have been claimed on the battlefield and in Ukrainian cities under attack from Russia. Alongside this, however, is escalating economic destruction. The Kyiv School of Economics says the war has cost Ukraine over $113.5 billion in damage. Major industries like agriculture and steel production has sustained massive losses, as getting exports out of the country remains complicated. Meanwhile, Western sanctions on Russia have sought to cripple its economy, to cut off financing for the war and help bring it to an end. The Kremlin has paid a heavy price, but perhaps not heavy enough. At this stage, I would like to introduce my guests, starting with Nick Connolly, our Ukraine correspondent, currently in Berlin for a few days before it's back to the front lines. On the line, we have Laura Solanko. She is Senior Advisor in BOFIT, Bank of Finland. She monitors Russian economic developments and economic policy. Welcome to you both. So I'd like to start with a question for both of you. Starting with you, Nick. If you could dial back the clock 6 months and adjust the Western response to Russian aggression with the knowledge that we have now, what would you change?
I think definitely the Ukrainian government would have wanted sanctions before Russian boots basically hit the ground in Ukraine. They were calling for preventative sanctions on Russia, and we do know now that the Russians were not expecting sanctions of a scale that we've seen this time around. They were expecting something more similar to what happened after the annexation of Crimea, which was a lot less damaging to their economy and a lot less wide-ranging. So Ukraine was calling for those as a kind of disincentive to Russia launching military action. And obviously the Ukrainians would also have wanted more weapons ahead of this in full-scale invasion. Basically, they got some anti-tank weapons, which proved very useful, but were not really able to really prevent those Russian advances in the first few months that saw Russian troops basically getting almost to Kiev.
So the sanctions should have been there in place to act as more of a deterrent. Laura, turning to you, what would you change?
Honestly, I think it's a wee bit too early to provide a good analysis on what should have been done differently. I do agree the sanctions against Russia are unprecedented, and especially the sanctions hitting the financial markets have been really, really harsh. Then the Western response in restricting Russia's exports has been somewhat more slow, and I think when thinking on the economic side of sanctions, that's probably somewhere a place where a bit more EU unity would have been helpful to get the decisions made faster. But broadly, I think we are sort of given the limitations of what economic sanctions can attain, what the EU and the West has been doing a pretty good job.
We're going to look at some of those Russian economic numbers more in detail, but we already told you a little bit in the beginning about the blows suffered by the Ukrainian economy. But here are some more figures. The International Monetary Fund has forecast a 35% drop in Ukrainian GDP this year. But Ukraine's economy minister says her country's economy could stabilize during the coming year and grow as much as 15.5%. Yulia Sviridenko said the growth depended on military developments in the war with Russia. So, Nick, there are real people behind these numbers, and you've spent a lot of time traveling around the country. Maybe you could give us a bit of a picture about how this economic impact looks like on the ground.
I mean, lots of people I know in Kiev have basically not had a full salary since the beginning of their war. I mean, lots of supply chains are now broken. They can't, even if they can produce their normal products, they can't get it out of the country because of the ports being shut off. We've seen some progress there with some of the food exports being allowed out, but metals and all the other kind of normal mainstays of Ukraine's economy are still blocked and stuck in the country. And these are products that, can be shipped by land, but it would be much more expensive, more difficult to do so. Lots of people are now basically at the end of their savings. They might have been able to get through the first few months at their normal kind of level of consumption, normal level of quality of life, but that definitely is ending now. Some people are doing okay. Those tend to be people in sectors like IT who have income coming in from abroad, whose job is basically mobile, and they are able, even if they've left the country or they've had to move from their hometowns further away from the front lines, they've been able to carry on working. But it's really, this war has exposed those differences and those imbalances between the kind of export-driven economy, in the knowledge economy, in the IT, and then the people who really are dependent on bricks and mortar, on infrastructure, on ports, on those kind of logistical supply chains that are now really not working and are really having a really devastating impact. I was with farmers a couple of weeks ago who were trying to get their grain out, and they were even questioning whether they'd be able to sow a new crop of grain because they hadn't been paid for any of the grain they'd have shipped. They had lots still left in their storage units, and they simply didn't have the cash to buy fertilizers, to buy seeds. So this is really a crunch time now, kind of 6 months in, where people are really asking themselves how we're going to keep on functioning. We've been kind of surviving for 6 months, but where does it go from here?
What is the answer to that question?
Lots of people are looking at the government for help, and there have been certain programs, especially for agriculture, in terms of kind of cheap loans, but as far as the wider economy and Ukraine's almost 40 million people, basically it's up to them to survive. I mean, Ukrainians are very used to getting by, to going abroad to earn money in case of economic kind of troubles back home. And that's obviously not an option right now for men who are not allowed to leave the country because they might be called up to serve in the army. There are lots of billions of euros coming in every month from Ukrainians abroad. It's one of the biggest sources of income for the country, and that's become even more important, those remittances, as the rest of the economy has kind of fallen away.
So new industries really proving to be a lifeline here. So I understand that people are just trying to survive the best they can, but how much of a topic is Russia's economy in Ukraine, given that it's also a proxy for how well equipped Russia is to continue its aggression?
Well, certainly there have been lots of social media kind of interest in terms of Western companies leaving, brands like McDonald's or the sportswear brands leaving Russia. That's been seen as a kind of sign that Russia is increasingly isolated and kind of on its own, facing up against kind of the wider West in this battle. I think for now, though, people are kind of painfully aware of the fact that Russia is actually making record-breaking earnings in terms of its energy exports, even though it's maybe selling lesser volumes because of issues with transport. But still, given the kind of unprecedented prices on energy right now, even if they're selling their oil and gas at a discount to new buyers in places like India and China, they're still bringing in hundreds of billions of dollars this year, and that is something that unfortunately for Ukraine is going to mean that Russia is able to keep up the war as it is at this current level of intensity for months, if not years to come.
Now, both Laura and Nick have already alluded to the state of the Russian economy, but it's information that bears repeating. So let's look at how, for example, the ruble has fared since the beginning of the war. When Russia invaded Ukraine on February 24, $1 could buy 80 rubles. After sanctions hit, the value of the ruble plummeted. On March 14, a dollar would buy 116 rubles. Yet by March 31, the currency had recovered to pre-war levels, hitting a high in June and stabilizing the last few weeks around the 60 rubles to $1 mark. Now, many economists predicted at the beginning of the war, when the West slapped myriad sanctions on Russia, that the country's economy would collapse. But a July forecast from the International Monetary Fund shows that despite the sanctions, the Russian economy is only expected to shrink by 6% this year, a big difference from the double-digit drop that some had predicted earlier this spring. Laura, I would like to turn to you again. So there's been a fair bit of divergence when it comes to analyses of how hard sanctions have actually hit the Russian economy. We've featured one prominent Yale study that says actually Russia's economy is on its knees, while others say the Russian economy is proving really resilient, citing, for example, that relatively strong ruble that we talked about and those import-export numbers. Where do you fall along the spectrum?
Well, clearly, Russian economy is doing better than we expected 6 months ago, and that's I would credit the skillful policy response, especially by the central bank, for that result, and also the somewhat more benign external environment than what we thought. But nevertheless, that only means that the economic decline this year will be a bit less than we thought. But on the other hand, the recession will continue into 2023. So all in all, we're still talking about a massive shock to the Russian economy. And sort of ironical in this is that the the GDP decline this year, next year together might be of a similar magnitude than what we thought in the spring. But this whole Russian recession is of its own making. Before the war broke out, we forecasted the GDP would grow at about 2%. And all the negative shocks ever since have just been caused by Russia's own actions.
Certainly self-inflicted harm there. So on the one hand, a lot is depending on Western power still for Russia's economy to decline sufficiently as to make war untenable. On the other hand, Ukraine's ability to stay solvent is dependent on how much support and aid it's going to get from its allies. So one of the Ukrainian cities hit hardest by the fallout of war is Odessa. Many people work in tourism, but that has come to a standstill there.
Many people need work, and it's the biggest problem because it's not only war, not only about weapons and soldiers, it's also about resources and budgets.
So Nick, as it is, Ukraine faces a monthly shortfall of about $5 billion in public finances. How do you assess the ability of Ukraine's allies to accordingly adjust the aid they're providing so that it corresponds with what Ukraine actually needs?
Well, I mean, if you look at the sums, actually, in terms of the numbers, they are not huge by international standards. If you compare the sums discussed here to the kind of sums that are now being pumped into Western European energy systems to make, to support energy importers who are now having to deal with increased gas prices, for instance, these are all pretty small numbers. But the issue is timing. So the Ukrainians have been complaining that time and time again there have been meetings where various Western governments have made pledges to support the Ukrainian government budget with either loans or just grants, but they're just not being transferred in a timely manner. And so we've had a few situations where you hear Ukrainian politicians saying it's 2 weeks till we have to pay this, that or the other, and the money just hasn't arrived from the Americans, from whoever else. So that is a real issue. Getting the awareness in Western capitals for the kind of timeliness of this along, on the same scale as the kind of awareness they have of the need for weapons deliveries, which we also know has been a kind of endless story of the Ukrainians complaining that the promises have been made, but they're not delivered on in anywhere near the kind of speed that they need.
So this is certainly a recurring theme. Now, we're seeing not enough international financial aid going to Ukraine at the moment, while especially Germany and its EU allies are only quite slowly extricating themselves from their trade relationship with Russia. So the Bank of Russia recently reported some figures that look at the difference in value between exports and imports, and those show the country's current account surplus for the first 7 months of 2022 surged to an all-time high of $166 billion. That's more than triple the amount from a year ago. Oil and gas revenues have soared, while sanctions have caused imports to plunge. Turning to Laura, oil and natural gas prices skyrocketed after the war began, but in the past, prices eventually stabilized. Do you think Russia's economy will be hit hard once prices do fall to levels seen last year?
The first thing to note probably is that as the demand for Russian oil and coal have declined, actually the Russian export prices are currently below the levels of January 2020. So from the point of view of Russia, the commodity prices have already stabilized back to where they were before the war. And this simply means that the record high tax revenues will decline. Already in July, the federal revenues from oil and gas were down by 20% compared to July last year. And all the other budget revenues outside from the oil and gas fell by nearly 30% year on year. This simply means that the sort of the months and maybe years ahead will be much tighter for the Russian fiscal policies, and the government really needs to plan to how to finance the deficit. This year, the deficit will be fairly manageable, but going into next year, if the current prices persist and export volumes drop, Russia will need a combination of cutting expenditures and resorting to non-standard means of financing the the deficit if it's going to remain afloat.
Okay, so at this stage, I would like to bring in final questions for the both of you. Well, it's the same one, actually. And we started with hindsight, so let's try and get speculative for this one. So the war can drag on indefinitely, and there's already a lot of talk about this being a war of attrition. Should the war go on another 6 months, what will the state of the Ukrainian economy be?
That's certainly a big question. I think the Ukrainian government is increasingly aware of the fact that right now they could, win the military battle, at least, in terms of holding the front lines where they are now, and at the same time lose the long-term future if they let too many people leave the country, if life in Ukraine becomes too difficult, if it's not a country where Ukrainians see themselves in a position to build lives themselves, build businesses, to create a future. So I think there certainly is a desire in Ukraine now to try and get back to some kind of normality, at least in the parts of the country that are further away from the front lines. We've seen Ukraine very successful in terms of its digitalization. You can basically have a digital passport, you can have all your government services online, and the Ukrainian government really interacting with Western tech giants there to bring in investment, to bring awareness for Ukraine and what it has to offer. So I think Ukraine is going to be pushing, trying to make IT a bigger part of its national economy. It's a sector that wars can't readily destroy or put an end to in its ability to create jobs and create investment. So I think that's something that the Ukrainians are really going to be pushing in the hope to make basically the the new war status quo kind of more palatable to ordinary Ukrainians who kind of have to find a way of going about their daily lives, living their family lives, developing a career at the same time as basically preparing potentially to go off and fight, if the government calls on them, months and weeks down the line.
I mean, we use the phrase new normal during the COVID pandemic a lot, arguably overused it, but I think it applies again this time around to Ukrainians and the war that they are experiencing. Laura, turning to you, what is your answer to this question? Another 6 months of war, where is Russia's economy going to be?
Certainly going to be in a more tight position than it's now, but certainly still fairly wealthy. It's the bit longer term view that is especially gloomy for Russia. I fully agree that sort of the Ukrainian government is currently doing a lot in trying to plan the rebuilding of the country and trying to take full benefit of integration with the Western countries and restructuring much of its economy to become more based on, whereas Russia is doing exactly the opposite. It's isolating itself from most of the world. It's isolating itself from the global scientific community, and it's sort of really trying to build a domestic economy that's only reliant on domestic innovation. That's the future in the longer term looks much bleaker for Russia than for Ukraine in this sense.
Well, Nick, at least Ukrainians will be able to take some hope from that. That's all for our business special looking at Ukraine and Russia's respective economies as the conflict slips into its 7th month. Many thanks to my guests Nick Connolly and Laura Solanko. If you've enjoyed this video, remember to hit like and subscribe, and why not check out some of our other stuff on our DW News channel on YouTube. From me and the team, goodbye, and we hope to see you again soon.